My name is Serena. I am 34 years old. I was standing in our master bedroom doorway watching my husband of 9 years zip a Louis Vuitton duffel bag, the one I bought him for our 7th anniversary, when he turned around, looked me directly in the eyes and said, "You'll be penniless without me. You've never earned a real dollar in your life." He said it calmly, like he'd rehearsed it, like he needed me to hear it land. And it did land. I felt it behind my sternum, the way you feel a cold draft before you see the open window. He picked up the bag and walked past me without touching my shoulder, without slowing down. At the bottom of the stairs, his phone buzzed. He smiled at the screen. I didn't have to wonder who it was. I already knew about Cassandra. I had known for 6 weeks. What Elliot Hale did not know, what he could not have known because I had been very, very quiet, was that 4 days before he packed that bag, I had already spoken to a forensic financial attorney named Margaret O.C. I had already opened a separate account at a credit union 40 minutes outside of town, and I had already begun the process of documenting 9 years of financial architecture that was built entirely on my inheritance, my grandmother's estate, and my ability to make money look like his idea. He walked out the front door at 7:43 in the evening on a Thursday in October. He was holding the black card, our joint Amex Centurion card, with a $60,000 limit, issued in both our names, funded by the business revenue that ran through the holding company I had quietly restructured 3 weeks prior. He walked out smiling with that card in his wallet, convinced he was leaving me with nothing. I stood at the window and watched his headlights disappear down the driveway. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and picked up my phone. I called the American Express Platinum Concierge line. I asked them to cancel the card ending in 4117. They confirmed the cancellation. I thanked them and hung up. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, and I finished my tea. This is that story. To understand what happened, you have to understand who Elliot Hale is and who I was when I married him. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in a house on Drayton Street that smelled like magnolia and old mahogany. My grandmother, Ruth Calloway, was the kind of woman who made everything look effortless. She wore linen in the summer, kept a garden that rivaled any in the county, and managed a small commercial real estate portfolio with the same quiet competence she applied to hosting dinner parties. She never made a fuss, she just produced results. And she left me everything when she passed. Just before my 25th birthday, 3 rental properties, a brokerage account worth $1.4 million, and a handwritten letter that said, "Be selective, Serena. Money is just a mirror. It shows you who people really are." I was 25 and in love and not yet wise enough to hold that mirror steady. I met Elliot Hale at a rooftop fundraiser in Atlanta. He was 30, lanky in a well-tailored way, with dark eyes and the laugh that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He worked in marketing consulting, had a small firm with 3 clients and enormous plans. He was charming the way people are charming when they need something and haven't found it yet. I didn't see that then. I saw the laugh, the plans, the ambition. I thought ambition was the same thing as integrity. I was wrong. We married 2 years later in a ceremony at the mansion on Forsyth Park. 90 guests, white peonies everywhere, a jazz quartet for cocktail hour, my grandmother's jewelry in my ears. I paid for the wedding entirely from my inheritance because Elliot's accounts were overextended, and he said we'd square it later. We didn't square it later. We never did. Here is the thing about Elliot that took me years to fully understand. He didn't lie the way most people lie, in sudden bursts that leave evidence. He revised. He smoothed. He took a situation and adjusted the framing so gradually that by the time the story landed, you couldn't find the seam between what was true and what he needed you to believe. He was exceptional at it, and he applied that talent to our finances from the very beginning. The first example was the beach house. 18 months after our wedding, I suggested buying a property in the Sea Islands as both a retreat and an investment. Elliot agreed enthusiastically, found the house, negotiated the price, and presented it to me as his discovery. When we closed on it, he told his golf friends it was a deal he put together. Not once did he mention that the down payment, $122,000, came from my grandmother's brokerage account. I was standing right next to him when he said it. I remember thinking, that's odd, but I let it go. That was the first time I let it go. The second example was the marketing firm. By year 3 of our marriage, Elliot's consulting practice had stalled. He had one anchor client, a regional grocery chain, and the contract was up for renewal. He was stressed in the way he always got when money was tight: shorter sentences, longer silences, an edge to his voice at dinner that he'd apologize for later with wine and a good story. I suggested we restructure. We created Hale and Callaway Creative Group, a limited liability company that merged his client relationships with my real estate income to create a more stable financial base. The name was my idea. Callaway, my grandmother's name. Elliot thought it sounded established. He never once said, "Serena built the foundation of this," to anyone. Not once in 6 years. By year 5, Hale and Callaway had 3 employees, a downtown Atlanta suite, and revenue of just over $800,000 a year. 80% of that revenue flowed from leases on my inherited properties. Elliot ran the marketing side. I managed the holding structure, the tax strategy, the vendor relationships, the banking. He gave the pitches. I made sure there was something to pitch. He took the lunches. I made sure the accounts could cover them. And socially, and this part is important, Elliot spoke about the business the way a man speaks about something he built from dirt and courage. Our friends, our neighbors, his family, all of them believed that Elliot Hale was a self-made success. I was the supportive wife. I was the quiet one. I was, in his telling, lucky to be along for the ride. I want to tell you about his mother, Patricia Hale, because she matters to this story. Patricia is 61, lives in a craftsman bungalow in Decatur, wears silk blouses to casual dinners, and has referred to me as Elliot's wife, not by name, for 9 years. On the surface, she is perfectly pleasant. She sends birthday cards on time. She brings a pecan tart to holidays. But she operates by a very specific social code, which holds that Elliot is exceptional, and everyone around him exists to reflect that exceptionalism back to him. When I made decisions, business decisions, financial decisions, household decisions, Patricia had a phrase she used. She'd tilt her head and say with a small smile, "Well, Serena always did like to be in charge of things," said sweetly, said constantly, said in a voice that made "in charge" sound like a character flaw. Elliot never corrected her. Not once. And I noticed. I always noticed. I just kept letting it go. Until I couldn't anymore. The third example, and the one that finally cracked something open in me, happened at the Dunwoodies' dinner party, 11 months before Elliot packed that bag. There were 12 of us around a long table in a dining room, with the kind of crown molding that takes a decade to restore. The conversation turned to investment property, and one of the husbands, a corporate attorney named Philip, asked Elliot how he'd gotten into commercial real estate. And Elliot leaned back in his chair, swirled his wine, and said, without pausing, without flinching, "I had a vision for it early on. My family didn't have money, so I had to build it differently. Creativity over capital, right?" He looked around the table. People nodded. Philip said, "That's impressive, man, self-made." And Elliot said, "That's the only kind worth being." I set down my fork, slowly. He was looking at Philip. He didn't look at me. I counted 7 seconds before I picked my fork back up. 7 seconds. That was the first time in 9 years I felt the very clear, very cold understanding that something was going to have to change. I didn't say anything at the table. But that night, after Elliot fell asleep, I lay in the dark and thought about my grandmother's handwriting on that letter. Money is just a mirror. It shows you who people really are. I had been watching that mirror every day for 9 years. and I had been refusing to see what was in it. The Cassandra situation. That's what I called it privately. The situation to me began, as far as I can piece together, somewhere in the spring of that same year. Cassandra Briggs was 27, worked in digital marketing, and had been a contract consultant for Hale and Callaway for approximately 4 months before I noticed that Elliot's Thursday evenings had a different texture. He still came home. He was still there for dinner. But there was a quality to his phone habits that had changed. Screens angled slightly, replies typed in the bathroom, a new, faint attentiveness to his appearance on ordinary mornings. I didn't confront him. That's important. I know a lot of people would have, but I had 9 years of experience watching Elliot Hale revise a story in real time, and I had learned that the moment you put a man like Elliot on notice, he starts rearranging. So I waited. I gathered. I was quiet in the way my grandmother was always quiet. Not because she didn't see, but because she was deciding what to do with what she saw. By August, I had confirmed enough. A receipt from a hotel in Buckhead, a restaurant charge in a neighborhood neither of us frequented, and a text message. Accidental. Sent to our home thread instead of his personal phone. That said only, "Can't wait to see you tonight." Sent at 2:46 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The message was from a contact saved as Cassandra B. I read it once, set the phone down, and went back to the quarterly property tax filing I had been working on. I finished the filing. Then I called Margaret O.C. Margaret is a forensic financial attorney. She is 53, wears her hair in a tight silver loke bun, and has spent 20 years untangling assets from marriages that were built, as she puts it, on one person's labor and another person's name. She came highly recommended by a friend who had used her 2 years prior in a quiet, decisive divorce. Margaret and I met for the first time over coffee at a hotel lobby near Piedmont Park. She asked me one question after I explained the situation. She said, "How much of the business is yours, structurally?" I said, "All of it. But none of it looks like it." She nodded slowly and said, "Then we have work to do." We had 6 weeks. 6 weeks of very quiet, very deliberate work while Elliot continued his Thursday evenings and his long lunches and his easy assumption that the woman he lived with would have nowhere to go when the time came. Margaret documented the inheritance chain, the Callaway estate, the property transfers, the original capitalization of Hale and Callaway Creative Group. She traced 9 years of financial contributions and identified which assets were separate property under Georgia law and which had been commingled in ways that still favored my position. She introduced me to a divorce attorney, a woman named Diane Cho, who practices family law in Fulton County and has a reputation for being thorough to the point of exhaustion. Diane and Margaret together were the 2 people who knew what was happening, no one else. Not my best friend Lydia. Not my cousin Bea. Nobody. I want to pause here for just a moment. If you've ever been in a situation where you knew things were falling apart and you had to hold that knowledge alone because the second you said it out loud, everything would accelerate before you were ready. If you know that feeling, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me, because carrying it quietly is one of the hardest things I have ever done. And if this story is hitting somewhere close, please subscribe. What happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell. 3 weeks before Elliot packed that bag, on the advice of Margaret and Diane, I made 3 significant moves. The first was to restructure the holding company. Hale and Callaway Creative Group was reorganized so that the rental property revenue stream, my inherited assets, flowed into a separate entity, Callaway Properties LLC, registered solely in my name, with a separate tax identification number and a separate bank account at a credit union I had selected for its distance from any institution Elliot used personally. This was not illegal. This was correcting a structural imbalance that had existed since the company's founding. Margaret handled the paperwork. I signed. It took 2 business days. The second move was the American Express account, the Joint Centurion card. The black card, the one with no preset spending limit that Elliot used freely, routinely, and with the casual confidence of a man who believed the money behind it was his, was a card issued under our joint names but tied to an account funded entirely by Hale and Callaway revenue. When Callaway Properties was separated, the revenue stream that backed that card changed. I notified American Express of the restructuring and updated the primary account holder information as part of the business reorganization. I did not cancel the card. Not yet. I let it sit. I waited. The third move was to call my grandmother's old property attorney, a 70-year-old man named Charles Webb, who had handled her estate with the precision of a watchmaker. I asked him to pull the original probate documents and prepare a certified chain of title for each of the 3 rental properties. This took 10 days. When the package arrived, I kept it in a red accordion folder in the back of my closet behind a stack of winter sweaters. That folder was my foundation. Every brick in my case was in it. Elliot did not notice any of this. Why would he? He had never been particularly interested in the operational details of the finances. He trusted that the machine would keep running because in his understanding of the world, he was the machine. He gave the speeches. He shook the hands. He had lunch with Cassandra Briggs on Thursdays and came home on time and told me about client calls that may or may not have happened. He was so certain of his position that certainty had made him careless. On the Monday before he packed that bag, I had a final call with Diane Cho. She walked me through the filing timeline. "We can have the petition ready within 48 hours of your go-ahead," she said. I told her to hold. I had one more thing to confirm. She asked what. I said, I want to know exactly where he thinks he is before I let him know where he actually is. On Thursday evening, Elliot came home at 6:15, which was earlier than usual. He was still carrying a duffel bag from what he said had been an overnight client meeting in Charlotte. He went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen making dinner. At 6:49, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had changed his shirt. He smelled like a different soap than the one we kept in our bathroom. He said, "We need to talk." I said, "Okay." He said, "I think we both know this isn't working anymore." I set down the wooden spoon. I turned around. "Okay," I said again. He looked briefly relieved, as if he had expected a scene. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said, "and I think it's better if I just go. We'll figure out the details." "What details?" I asked. "The house, the business, all of it." He made a gesture with his hand. A sort of easy, sweeping gesture. The kind you make when something feels simple. "You'll be fine. We'll work it out." I looked at him. "Where are you going?" he said. "I'm staying at the Lou's for a bit while we sort things." I nodded. I already knew it wasn't the Lou's. He went back upstairs. I heard the closet opening and closing, hangers shifting, drawers. He came back down 22 minutes later with the Louis Vuitton bag, a garment bag over his shoulder, and the carry-on rolling behind him. He stood at the base of the stairs and looked at me and said it. "You'll be penniless without me. You've never earned a real dollar in your life." Then he walked to the front door, picked up his keys from the entry table, took his wallet from his jacket pocket, the wallet with the Amex Centurion card, and he left. I stood at the window. I watched the headlights go. 7:43 in the evening. October. And the air outside the window had that thin, cold smell of a season shifting. I went to the kitchen. I made tea. I sat down. I picked up my phone. I called American Express. The concierge answered on the second ring. I gave my account information. I said I'd like to cancel the card ending in 4117 effective immediately. The concierge confirmed. I asked whether any pending charges would still process. She said no. Any authorization after the cancellation timestamp would be declined. I thanked her and hung up. I knew exactly where he was going. I knew he would stop for dinner. I knew he would use that card. I finished my tea. Then I called Diane Cho and said, "You can go ahead." I want to tell you what I later learned about the evening of Thursday, October the 16th, at a restaurant called Arlo's in Midtown Atlanta. I know what happened because Lydia, my best friend who I had not told any of this to until that Sunday, has a cousin who waited tables at Arlo's, and happened to be working that night. Elliot arrived at 8:12 with Cassandra Briggs. They sat at a corner table. They ordered cocktails. They ordered dinner. They were relaxed in the way people are relaxed when they believe they have escaped something. When the check came, Elliot handed over the black card. The server returned to the table approximately 2 minutes later. She leaned down and said in a low voice that the card had been declined. Elliot said there must be a mistake. He handed it back and asked them to try again. It was declined a second time. Cassandra watched this happen. The corner table was not private enough for it not to matter. Elliot checked his phone. His face, according to Lydia's cousin, went from confusion to something harder. He paid with a personal debit card that left his checking account with $63. He left a 17% tip on a $208 bill. He walked out without his usual swagger. Cassandra walked behind him. She did not look the way she had when they came in. In the days that followed, Elliot called me 4 times. The first call was that same night at 10:41. I did not answer. He left a voicemail that said, "Serena, there's something wrong with the Amex. Can you call them?" I think there was an error. I saved the voicemail. The second call was the next morning at 8:53. He said, "I need to talk to you about the business accounts. Something's off." I saved that one too. The third call came at 2:17 that afternoon and his voice had changed. The smoothness was gone. He said, "What did you do?" I saved it. The fourth call came at 6:44 that evening and he said, "Serena, we need to talk. This isn't right. Call me back." His voice had crossed into the register I had never heard from him before, something that sounded like actual fear. I saved that one as well. I didn't call back. Diane Cho called him instead. He received the divorce petition via process server the following Monday morning at the temporary furnished apartment he had rented in Midtown. It was not the lose. I need to tell you about the public moment, because this story has one and it matters. 2 weeks after Elliot received the petition, Patricia Hale, his mother, organized a family lunch at a restaurant in Buckhead called Garrison's. She called my mother-in-law's sister, 2 of Elliot's college friends, and their wives, and she called me. She said it was an opportunity for everyone to talk calmly and sensibly. I knew exactly what it was. It was an audience assembled so that Elliot could perform his version of events in front of witnesses before the story got away from him. I went. I wore a cream blazer and my grandmother's pearl earrings, and I ordered sparkling water, and I sat quietly while Patricia opened the lunch by saying, "We all want what's best for both of them. Elliot has worked so hard to build something wonderful, and we just want to make sure everyone walks away with what they deserve." Elliot sat across from me. He had on a charcoal shirt. He looked tired in the way people look tired when they've been working hard to revise a story that keeps developing faster than they can keep up. He said, "Serena, I know you're upset, but the business is joint property. What you're doing with the holding company is not legal." That last sentence was said in front of 6 people. He said it with the flat confidence of a man who had decided that saying something firmly enough was the same as it being true. I looked at him. I let a beat pass. Then I looked at the table generally and I said, "I have the certified chain of title for each of the 3 Callaway properties. I have the original probate documents from Ruth Callaway's estate, dated 12 years ago. I have 9 years of capitalization records showing the source of every dollar that funded Hale and Callaway Creative Group. Our forensic financial attorney has prepared a 41-page asset trace. If anyone at this table would like to review it, my attorney can send it to you by end of business today." The table went quiet. Patricia set down her water glass. One of the college friends, a man named Greg, looked at Elliot with an expression I had never seen directed at Elliot before. It was the expression you get when you suddenly realize someone has been telling a story and you've only ever heard one side of it. Elliot said, That's not all accurate." He looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at the table. She said nothing. She had nothing to say, because I had just said it in front of everyone, and she knew that nothing I had said was untrue. and she was smart enough to know what that meant. I picked up my sparkling water. I took a small sip. Then I said, I'm going to let the attorneys handle the specifics. I just thought it was worth clarifying, since the goal of today was to make sure everyone walks away with what they deserve. I set the glass down. I looked at Elliot. His jaw was tight, his eyes had gone flat, and in that flatness I could see the exact moment the performance stopped working. The exact moment he understood that the woman across the table from him was not the woman he had left standing at the kitchen window. She had been replaced by someone who had been very quiet and very deliberate and very, very ready. The lunch ended 40 minutes later. There was no resolution. There was no grand gesture. People finished their food and gathered their things and left the way people leave a room where something important has just shifted, and nobody quite knows what to do with the shift. Patricia hugged Elliot on the sidewalk. She didn't hug me. She did, however, as she passed me, pause for 1 second, look at me, and say in a voice that had lost its silk blouse smoothness entirely, I had no idea. I said, I know. And that was all. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. Georgia is an equitable distribution state, which means the courts divide marital assets fairly rather than equally, and fairly is a word that rewards documentation. Margaret O'C's 41-page asset trace was a cornerstone of the proceedings. Elliot's attorney challenged the Callaway Properties restructuring twice. Both challenges were dismissed. The 3 rental properties remained separate property, as they had been since my grandmother's estate was settled. Elliot retained his personal marketing clients, his car, and the condominium he had rented. The revenue structure of Hale and Callaway was unwound, and I walked out with the assets I walked in with, plus an equitable share of the business appreciation that had occurred during the marriage. Elliot walked out with less than he came in with, not because I was vindictive, but because math is patient and precise in a way that charm never quite is. Cassandra Briggs did not attend the finalization hearing. She had not been seen with Elliot publicly since approximately 3 weeks after the Arlo's dinner. That is not my story to tell. It's just a detail I noted and filed away. I want to tell you about what I did the first weekend after the divorce was final. I drove down to Savannah. I went to Drayton Street and stood outside the house where I grew up. And then I drove to Green Meldrum Church, where my grandmother used to attend Sunday service. And I sat in a pew near the back for about 20 minutes. I didn't pray exactly. I just sat in the quiet of a very old room and let myself be still. I thought about Ruth Callaway standing in her garden with linen on in August heat, teaching me to read Elise. I thought about the letter she left me. Money is just a mirror. I thought about how long I'd spent looking at the mirror and choosing not to see it clearly. And I thought about how quiet you have to be sometimes before you can finally see something true. Lydia drove down to meet me that Sunday. We had dinner at a place on Jones Street that does a shrimp and grits that my grandmother used to order. We split a bottle of wine. Lydia said, "You know what I keep thinking about? The fact that he said you'd be penniless. Like that was even a thing that could be true." I picked up my glass. "He believed it," I said. "That's the thing, he genuinely believed it." Lydia shook her head. "How?" I thought about it for a second. "Because I let him," I said. "Not anymore. I'm not going to tell you I have it all figured out. I don't. I'm 34 and starting over in some real and practical ways. And starting over at 34 is not the same thing as starting over at 25. There are days when the house is very quiet and the quiet has a particular texture to it that I haven't fully made peace with yet. There are days when I catch myself picking up my phone to tell my grandmother something and then remembering. Those days are not small, but they are mine. Every one of them is mine. And the thing about having a foundation that you built, the thing nobody tells you when you're sitting in a marriage pouring concrete into someone else's floor, is that when you finally walk out and stand on your own ground, you already know how solid it is. You built it. You know every inch of it. Nobody can tell you it isn't real. If you are watching this and you are in a situation where someone is spending what you built and calling it theirs, I want you to hear this clearly. Being quiet is not the same as being powerless. Sometimes being quiet is the most powerful thing you can do. Document everything. Know your foundation. Find the Margaret O.C. in your life, the person who can show you exactly what is yours and exactly how to protect it. You don't have to make a scene. You don't have to raise your voice. You just have to be ready. And then, when the moment comes, stay calm, stay still, and make the one move that changes everything. Elliot thought penniless meant having nothing. What he never understood was that the woman he left standing at the kitchen window had been building something for 9 years that was never his to take. He just never bothered to look at what he was standing on long enough to realize it wasn't his floor. I'll see you in the next video. And before you go, I want to take a moment and speak directly to you, every single one of you who has watched this far, who shared this with a friend, who dropped a comment that took 30 seconds out of your day but meant everything to us. This channel exists because of you. Every story we tell because we believe the women who lived through these moments deserve to have their truth spoken out loud, with dignity, with care, and without apology. We're a small team, and we put everything we have into making each story feel real, because the emotions behind them are real. If this story moved you in any way, if it made you feel seen, or stronger, or less alone, please consider subscribing and sharing it with one person in your life who might need to hear it. Every subscriber is another voice saying these stories matter, and to us they always will. Thank you for being here. We mean that every single time.